Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show, everybody. We're broadcasting live from the ongoing lockdown zones with super producer Matt Leck.
Yo.
Economist. And I was going to say man about town, but it's man about the apartment these days, David Griscom.
Pretty much. How's it going?
Going well on this week's program. Dustin, Guastella, Dino from the Teamsters and from Jacobin. We're talking about why Bernie lost, what the strategy and the game plan is moving forward. Can we ever build a viable left? And what would that actually look like strategically? What habits would have to be let go of? What new habits would have to be cultivated? Very excited to talk about that with Dustin and read his indispensable piece in Jacobin, jam-packed postgame. We're talking about stunning new footage in Brazil of a cabinet meeting, talking about overt moves to fascism, in fact. I mean, literal fascism in Brazil. With an update on the Bolivian coup regime. They are not only, of course, mishandling Corona, they are not scheduling new elections. Remember, Evo Morales was removed in a coup after winning the last legitimate elections that happened in Bolivia. Iranian oil tankers coming to Venezuela, both opposed by the aggressive Trump administration and United States efforts at undermining both governments. Plus, of course, a debunk and much more with Ben Burgess. And in the main show, we've got a lot more to look at, including, as always, a gem. What's going on with the gem, Dave?
Oh, we're talking about debt imperialism again and Argentina's fight for basic human dignity.
A lady tried to incite an arrest, possibly a murder in Central Park. Snitch videos are garbage. This wasn't a snitch video. This was a video of something that was an appalling, obscene act in and of itself, and also has implications around policing generally that we're going to discuss in the post-game as well, and a whole lot more. But first, we've got to talk about the fate of the Earth and the future and reality of global arms control. Now, I'm going to start by quoting, this is in light of news that the Trump administration has declared that the U.S. will leave the OST, or Open Skies Treaty, which allows countries, including Russia and the United States, to conduct observation flights in each other's airspace. This was initially proposed back in the Eisenhower era. It was not implemented until negotiations between George Herbert Walker Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev during the Glasnost and Perestroika era. And this did a significant amount, and it's still done a significant amount, to cool down tensions and allow countries to engage in transparency in each other's nuclear and weapons capacities. I'm going to quote now from Michael Crepin, writing in Forbes. Donald Trump has now surpassed all of his predecessors combined when it comes to walking away from agreements to reduce nuclear dangers and weapons. His administration announced that withdrawal from the 1992 Open Skies Treaty marks the third agreement to be deep sixth on his watch, after the Iran nuclear deal negotiated in the Obama administration and the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty negotiated in the Reagan administration. Previously, Trump was tied with George W. Bush, who withdrew from two agreements, one with Russia and another with North Korea. Trump's record of walking away from the accomplishments of his predecessors has not made America safer. As arms control unravels, nuclear dangers grow, and U.S. alliances fray. A report from the Washington Post last week revealed that the Trump administration has been considering a weapons test, a first in 28 years, and a display of raw aggression against China and Russia. And let's bring up this piece from Reuters with a Trump administration official who said that what the United States plans to do is spend Russia and China into oblivion in an arms race. This is the U.S. weapons envoy. Now, if you could just scroll down, I'm going to read from this. U.S. President Donald Trump's nuclear negotiator on Thursday said the United States is prepared to spend Russia and China into oblivion in order to win a new nuclear arms race. The president has made clear that we have tried and true practice here. We know how to win these races, and we know how to spend adversaries into oblivion if we have to. We will, and we would like to avoid it, said Special Presidential Envoy Marshall Billingsley in an online presentation to a Washington think tank. All this is taking place in the context of enhanced aggression towards China and ongoing, deeply shaky relations with Russia. Of course, Russia itself has also been itching to pull out of the Open Skies Treaty. Trump has, as we've said before, moved out of SALT. And when the New START expires in 2021, it will be the first time in 50 years that there will be no agreement between the world's largest powers to limit their arsenals. The current U.S. stockpile is 3,800 active warheads. 1,600 of these are in ICBMs or in SLBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. During the Obama administration, the record was mixed, starting with the incredible accomplishment and success of the Iran deal that Joe Biden has indicated he would return the United States to should he be elected president. Obama also entered into a new agreements on limiting the arsenals and arms reductions with Russia. At the same time, Obama promised to modernize U.S. nuclear systems in 2010. Shortly before the U.S. nuclear deal New START, by 2016, the program had gone far beyond the original vision, including a program to develop and deploy a new ICBM or intercontinental ballistic missile. Trump has increased nuclear spending by an estimated 23% from Obama's estimates, increasing the U.S. access to plutonium, which is more radioactive and powerful than uranium. The Trump administration's plan increases, quote, U.S. capabilities to quickly produce new or additional weapons. This is in addition to the 3,800 weapons the U.S. already possesses. Pursuing research on new types of mobile ICBMs and the creation of hypersonic missiles for nuclear delivery. Trump's pursuit of unilateralism has damaged the global system of nonproliferation at a dangerous time, when Russia and China have both signaled an expansion of their own arsenals and programs. We're entering into a new multipolar dynamic and an infrastructure that, despite many flaws, had served the world well, is being aggressively unraveled by the Trump administration. And we know that this poses a threat to all of us. And the only way to restore sanity to global arms control is coordinated international action and pressure from citizens in an already deeply strained world. But this is important to track. I mean, this is foundational stuff. This is the capacity really of the human race to survive. And there is a deep ideological pull that's always been, very aggressive in Republican circles to undermine these agreements. John Bolton took to Twitter. Supposedly, he was so disgusted by the Trump administration, he was very happy to praise Trump pulling out of Open Skies. So this is stuff that we need to track, and this is stuff that is profoundly dangerous.
Mm-hmm. It's so frightening to think that very likely, coming into 2021, that the United States and Russia will not have any kind of international treaty, with governing their weapons stockpiling. That was supposed to be something that was behind us, and the main goal was getting rid of these stockpiles. But the Trump administration recently was talking about testing a nuclear weapon, something we haven't done since the early 90s. I think everyone listening to this understands the gravity of the threat of nuclear, proliferation. But it's one of those things that it's so, I don't know, it's difficult to wrap your head around, and it happens so slowly, the way that this can just sort of ratchet itself up. Yeah. That it's important not to take your eye off the ball, because Trump has really been doing a lot of this basically behind the scenes because it's not the thing that comes up to the top of the news feed for most folks.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, this isn't something to be complacent about the dangers to. Even when Obama was president, it was almost like the sort of thing when Trump was coming in office. You're like, well, maybe we can use him to renew our focus on these areas that we're not paying close enough attention to, and to our horror 4 years later, we're really not. But there's books like Daniel Ellsberg's Doomsday Machine, Eric Schlosser, Command and Control, and there's another one called The Dead Hand. I mean, they'll terrify you. If you want to be existentially terrified, this is a subject I think equal on par with climate change that's just horrifying. And we don't take it seriously enough, and almost because it's like too horrifying to really think about on a regular basis. And there's nothing we can do really, except, I mean, hopefully get a bureaucracy that can take care of this stuff and sign some deals, maybe. I don't know.
You know, and we're lucky to be in the position of being in the U.S., for example. Like, I mean, it worries me enough, don't get me wrong, but can you imagine being in a country that doesn't have access to a nuclear weapon and and having the thought that, you know, the survival of the human species depends on the politics and the decisions of bureaucrats of the United States and Russia and China? I mean, it's completely absurd just on a moral level that, you know, certain governments basically are able to hold the fate of the world in their hands, you know, with an action that could be done so quickly.
It's literally one of the most absurd things possible, like, on a planet, I think. That, like, yeah, I think Kennedy said that. He had some famous quote, like, some kid somewhere won't, like, wake up on a spring day because he decided to. Like, that will never happen again. And it's like, it's just so, it's super absurd. It's just mass extinction at the push of a button.
Right. And outside of a context where types of theorists love the fact that, of course, on some level, the fact that the world would be liquidated limited what could have been a hot war in Europe, what could have been much more aggressive confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, that frame is a problem because it doesn't account for the millions of lives that were lost in proxy wars really across the world. And, you know, the Soviets supporting various liberation movements and, you know, intransigent regimes that both governments supported. So there was obviously a huge amount of hot conflict and cost to human life because of the Cold War. However, yes, there's no doubt that because of mutually assured destruction, that those two superpowers did not go up against each other, even though we know it came very close. The most famous, of course, you know, Cuba. But in today's environment, you don't have that same kind of sort of basic one-to-one, because even the other countries that are, you know, China did, I mean, China went nuclear in the 60s, maybe even earlier, actually. So you did have this sort of Chinese dimension. And then France and the UK are, you know, basically part of the same Western security architecture. But, you know, in today's world, you have, you know, Russia's going to keep their arsenal, so they maintain relevance. You have generations of people in the United States who are really interested in how these things can be usable. Can you build ones that are small enough that they could be deployed tactically? I mean, there's really disturbing stuff.
Yeah. And
then again, places like the UK and France that, you know, want to maintain their relevancy. China is going to continue to play just a different and more powerful role in the world, and that's part of it. And then, of course, you know, it's not even accounting for the fact that India and Pakistan is the most dangerous place on earth. That would be the most likely place that it would happen. And the only conclusion that North Korea can possibly draw from anything, whether it's Iraq, Libya, or Iran, and its own experience. I mean, they're surrounded by a huge amount of military presence on the peninsula. Of course, they've continued that development. And, you know, I mean, there's a lot of trust, you know, after that governments, you know, including in South Africa and Brazil, I mean, they dismantled programs, you know, based on the idea that we were actually moving towards that shared goal after the Cold War. And now we're going the absolute opposite direction. And then go to the Middle East. Israel has it. They won't acknowledge it. Israel, in addition to being the most powerful military, has the arsenal. Will Iran, you know, change their mind? There's no actual hard evidence that Iran's ever pursued it before, but certainly in their rational interest to pursue it. And if they do, no doubt the Saudis will. So all at the same time that the Trump administration is very aggressive and belligerent around undermining all of the frameworks that have worked.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, is that it's just like what the Trump administration is doing is it's not just like a one-for-one with the United States and Russia. You know, the idea is that like if you have these two countries sort of working together to stop the spread and basically the further development of these weapons, then, you know, that's going to sort of trickle down towards the other nations like in their spheres of influence, right? And this just completely eradicates any kind of international standard for, you know, what is and isn't acceptable when it comes to these weapons. It's beyond reckless. Yeah, I mean, easily one of the more frightening developments that we've had in the past 3 years, which just say a lot with the Trump administration.
And it can't be emphasized enough. I mean, tearing up the Iran deal is a world historical assault. It was the most successful thing in foreign policy by far that the Obama administration had done. It was an actual concrete positive step that could pay enormous dividends on a variety of hot issues. And the Trump administration, and I think any Republican president would have ended up doing the same thing, frankly, aggressively went after it, tore it up, ripped it up, partially, obviously, at the behest of the aggressive undermining by Israel and by Saudi Arabia. And no one questions that the deal was working, and no one questions that Iran was in full compliance. That's, I mean, you know, I repeat that a lot, but I'll keep repeating it.
People need to know that.
People really, 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 really need to know that. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about why you should become a patron. Maybe you might want to take a little sip of herbal tea or something after all of that. I don't know the balance of how to cover things like that, because on some level, I do think just sort of kind of doomsday thinking that you can't do anything about is problematic because it's very disempowering. And then on the other hand, I think some of these things, you know, they at least need to be in our awareness. It needs to be in our awareness that these agreements are being ripped up and the enormous danger that this administration is hurtling towards because of them. And I also think sometimes maybe when we think more foundationally and existentially, it can clear up our minds and take us away from some of the kind of endless cycles of bullshit and nonsense that we distract ourselves with. So
well, it's also, on a simple level, it's dollars in the pockets of our enemies, like these companies that are going to be getting the contracts for these. Like, let's just not give them any more cash unless they're decommissioning that shit.
100%. 100%. So, guys, keep it short and sweet. Become a patron of the Michael Brooks Show today. This is how we grow. This is how we do what we do. And it's very important to hit first that 4,000 patron mark, then 5,000 and 6,000. We have 4,000 right in our sights. Obviously, we've been slowed down because of what's happening. But some of you are definitely still in a position to get all of our content and build out the show that we do. So do it. Go to patreon.com/TMBS. This last illicit history we just did with Mark Ames on the role of American political consultants in building the whole propaganda apparatus of modern Russia, the illicit history of the 1996 Yeltsin re-election campaign, as the United States was basically helping turn Russia into a mafia state backed by shock therapy and Wall Street and austerity. These are the stories and the context that help us understand the world we're in today. Next week, we're going to be recording a two-parter on Pakistan. From today, the crisis today with Imran Khan, the role of the ISI, which is Pakistan's intelligence service, going back to the bonds that were built between Saudi Arabia, the CIA, the intelligence services, the Mujahideen in the 1980s. What happened in Afghanistan then is still shaping our lives today. So these illicit histories are deep dives. We're going to be unlocking a two-parter soon that we just did with Brian Mayer on Mashal in Mozambique, which is one that I'm incredibly proud of. And we also have a lot of fun additional conversations with a huge variety of guests covering everything from political theory to African politics to sport. And when you're a patron, you get to stick around for the post games we've been doing, and we'll continue to occasionally do these Sunday economics conversations, which is for everybody, really trying to refine, hone, and put out the content. If you become an $8 a month patron, you get every single show, period. At a $21 a month or above, you sometimes get conference calls with me, and you support the illicit history documentaries we make. Now, the audio illicit histories that we do are part of our regular Sunday features. Everybody gets them. The video documentaries, the upper level patrons get them first because they're the ones that make them possible, that are those incredible work with Vic Viana that we do. And then they're unlocked for everybody on our YouTube page because we want to get this stuff out as much as possible behind a paywall, even as we support ourselves and everybody in getting this stuff out. So it's educational, it's entertaining, it's fun. I'm proud of what we're doing. We're going to play a little clip in case you missed it of our illicit history we did of Jamaica, tracking the rise of the shower posse, CIA undermining of the Michael Manley government, and where Jamaica is today. This is going to be a little over a minute to check it out. Go to patreon.com/TMBS. And of course, if you need a deal, let us know and we will make it work. Patreon.com/TMBS. Let's take a brief look at this.
Reported murders. The other aspect of this killing, and this will lead us to Seaga specifically, is that there is a gang called the Shower Posse, which was able to rise in Jamaica when Seaga took power in the 1980s. And the Shower Posses was led by a guy named Jim Brown, or Lester Coke, who was a personal bodyguard and political enforcer for Edward Seaga, and was able to, in fact, travel on a diplomatic passport. Edward Seaga defeated the democratic socialism of Michael Manley. He was associated and very close with the Reagan administration. There were comparisons between him and the Duvalier regime in Haiti. He came to power, he implemented austerity, he liberalized markets, he helped the DEA in a very ruthless crackdown of marijuana cultivation in Jamaica. So an economic assault on what Manley had attempted to do in terms of creating broader prosperity and a form of social democracy in Jamaica, a reorienting towards the traditional land-holding elites that controlled Jamaica, a very, very small group of people, the sort of remnants of colonial occupation. Then he sort of returned Jamaica to the orbit of the United States.
Okay, guys, so you have a dose of that. The one we have behind the wall right now is an illicit history of Thomas Sankara, which you can unlock as a patron. It's great. I'm incredibly proud of it. The rest of them, including the one you just watched, you can go on the illicit history playlist and watch them right now. Go become a patron if you can, patreon.com/TMBS. And also order Against the Web, Cosmopolitan Case, Answer to the New Right at Red Emma's or IndieBound, where you can shop and buy at an independent bookstore. Definitely buy all your books. But if you're buying books at independent bookstores like Workers Own, Red Emma's in Baltimore. And we've got some other news for you guys coming soon on additional self-published TMBS book projects, which I'm very, very excited about. We're going to take a brief break, and we will be right back with Dustin Guastella on The Michael Brooks Show. Thanks for watching. welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Dustin Dino Guastella. He's the Director of Operations for Teamsters 623. He's also part of Philadelphia DSA, and he writes regularly for Jacobin Magazine. His new piece, We Need Class War, Not a Culture War, has just been published, and we're going to be talking about that among other important topics. Dino, thanks so much for doing this, man. How are you?
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Always a pleasure. So this piece, I guess, is a reply to a piece that Angela Nagel and Michael Tracy put out critiquing the Sanders campaign. And I want to just, before we get to the disagreements, I mean, what do you think generally, like, what did they get right in that piece? Did they, what did they get right?
Yeah, I mean, I think they got, it was an attempt at a postmortem that looked heavily at the messaging aspect of the Sanders campaign and looked at that compared to, comparing 2020 to 2016. And I think some of what they got right, and I said this in the piece, is that they did notice something significant, which is that the contemporary left, what is an unfortunate phrase for it, but the woke politics of the contemporary left is somewhat alienating, right? And it does drive voters away. And I think they accurately assess that that's a true thing that happens in political campaigns. Where I think they went wrong is that I don't think Bernie was really that candidate, and I don't think Bernie's loss can really be attributed in any significant way to that kind of posturing or that kind of rhetoric. So what they got right was this fault line in American politics is important, and it is divisive, and it can be costly for the left. And I think it certainly was for a candidate like Elizabeth Warren, or all the candidates that sort of tried to play kind of ultra woke left, feign left ultra woke posture. They all did very badly. But I just think when it comes to Sanders, that falls on deaf ears. I don't think it's true for Sanders. I think there are a million reasons why, and we can get into that. But yeah, I mean, that's what I think they were trying to do.
So yeah, and we'll get into that. So then the other kind of really big part of the argument generally, which I think can be relatively easily cleared up, and I guess I'll just state it and see if you agree with me. I think people like you and I, and certainly I thought that Bernie Sanders had a chance of winning. I thought that there was, I don't know, and I think I've actually said this, in real time, 20%, 25%. So not in any ways a slam dunk, but an unparalleled opportunity to elect somebody with that kind of politics to the most important political office in the world. So you take advantage of that. And I think, and there were differences too, but I mean, I certainly felt a lot of frustration that, people were definitely fucking around with other candidates. And I think the rhetoric and the idea of pushing him to the left, quote unquote, was ludicrous and absurd and just, huge amount of problems, particularly in these sort of zones. I don't know how much they kind of translate necessarily to the door-to-door. And at the same time, it's not that he never, I think when people say, look, he never could have won, obviously that's ridiculous. We wouldn't have put the energy that we could have put in. And I think that is a cop-out. I think they're right to call it a cop-out. At the same time, this counter-narrative that all of the traditional laws of politics apply. He's the Democratic runner-up last time. He raised a lot of money. Look, yeah, he did raise a lot of money. And how that money was spent and, the strategic choices that were made, absolutely valid areas for criticism and interrogation. But just on this very simple point of how much of a sort of slam dunk this was going to be, I think we got to be real, both in terms of not just saying, oh, it never could have happened, so we don't have to improve our game. And I think that's a very problematic discourse. But then on the other hand, the idea that just, this was like any other sort of Democratic candidate riding on a wave of being runner-up. No, obviously not. And I don't think any of us thought that, even when we were at our most optimistic.
Right. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It's like, the way I would think about it is, first, you have to preface it by saying there's no such thing as a perfect campaign, because politics is not, a science. It's an art, right? So you read what you can do in the moment. You're constantly changing what you can do. But the way that we can put it in a way to sort of avoid the trap of saying there's nothing we could have done, this is it, this was all it was ever going to be, is to say in a game where the balance of forces is so stacked against us, we have to be as close to perfect as possible. And this was something that FDR's advisors used to always say. They would say that, we were perfect campaigners. They didn't make mistakes on the campaign trail. And so insofar as there's an argument, you can say, we made mistakes, right? And you can identify innumerable mistakes that were made throughout the entire campaign, whatever, right? But that to leap from had we fixed those mistakes, the kind of if only, shoulda, coulda, woulda, to we would have cakewalked through the election, that to me is a leap we can't take, right? So we can say in the fires of a campaign, like, look, we shouldn't have done this, we should have done this, blah, blah, blah. But when you try to extrapolate that from, those little mistakes, the tweaks here and there, and act as if that negates the immense structural power that we're going up against, I think that's a leap. And it's a dangerous leap because it suggests that the process of politics is internal to the political leaders themselves. That if only they made the right choices, then victory is within reach, right? And I said this about the 1983 campaign, the UK Labour campaign, I think it rings true for a lot of defeats, which are, you could do everything right. You could get every single thing right on the campaign trail, in your party, you can somehow manage to run a spectacular, perfect, tight ship throughout the entire campaign and still lose. And so we have to be prepared for understanding the dynamics between a politics that ultimately does not reward our side very often, extremely rare, especially in democratic cases. I mean, how many times has a democratic socialist won government anywhere in the world? It's incredibly rare. So we have to take stock of that while also being critical of the challenges that be. So yeah, Bernie could have won. We could have run a perfect campaign. There could have been a lot of different things that aligned differently. Somehow the DNC could have not gotten their act together. These external forces could have aligned to make things work. We could have pumped out those infrequent voters and really turned out the base that we wanted to turn out. But it didn't happen that way. And a lot of that was not the fault of the campaign. A lot of that was totally external to the campaign. And I think we have to keep that in mind in order to understand what we're up against and what we're trying to do.
Right. I mean, I think it is, though, really, really important to underline where I disagree. I mean, one area, I don't even want to get into the whole Russiagate stuff. But I mean, look, I think clearly the critics of Russiagate have been more validated than the people who have been sympathetic to Russiagate, and in terms of the overall balance sheet of that story. And at the same time, I did think, writing a piece that correctly said this campaign was way overindulgent of like online discourse that had nothing to do with what normal voters of any background want. I agree with that completely. I think it's 100% valid criticism. And then also at the same time saying, that, Bernie should have been like, Russiagate's a hoax. I mean, unfortunately, guys, bad news. The same people who are going to roll their eyes at kind of woke shit are, some of those same people are totally convinced that Trump is a KGB agent. So if we're going to have a conversation about what is politically real, then it's got to be a conversation about what's politically real. And the one I use all the time that implicates me is like, yeah, I would like Americans to have a good relationship and understanding, at least be able to historicize Fidel Castro. But no, presidential frontrunner should not be talking about, and I should not be explaining Fidel Castro's real record weeks before votes are happening. This is a strategic mistake. So I think so again, even if it's only 10, 15% internal, all the more reason there can't be any fuck ups. And there were definitely fuck ups, and some of them they identified. Do you think, though, that it gets to like a kind of bigger contradiction that I see about how Bernie's talked about? And it's funny because it crossed even, I think, both sides inside the campaign, which was that at times you had one contingent that was very into this like revolution discourse. And then on the other, which could, again, I think totally, I mean, I'll say anecdotally, like my grandma in Florida, she likes Bernie. That, she liked the FDR stuff, not the revolution stuff. And at the end of the day, she was comfortable with Biden, right? Like that very much exists. And, And then on the other hand, I think there were actually people in the other part of the campaign who might have been more sort of conventionally aligned with the Democratic Party, who I didn't think actually fully anticipated how much Bernie was going to be resisted, how much he was going to be hated by the donor class and by the corporate class. And you saw this weird parallel in the sort of sub-left conversation, because on one hand, it was sort of like, you know, revolution, 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 Bernie, Bernie, Bernie. And then other people saying like, yeah, you know, this is just like FDR, you know, like, yeah, just like FDR, you know, no big deal there. Not like programs that still help people today were created in that era. But besides rolling my eyes at the nonsense of that, you know, people had a way, I think, of misjudging in both directions, where they either looked at his program and they said, because it's not like a call to, you know, collectivize the means of production, it's just social democracy, and therefore it's not that big of a deal, and therefore it's not that much of a threat, versus other people that really hyped certain languages that could have been popularly alienating, while maybe soft pedaling that in today's political environment, even Medicare for all alone is an enormous threat to the most powerful sectors of our society, and they acted accordingly.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, you know, to your point, the challenge for any presidential candidate is they have to be able to find that line in real time. You know what I mean? They have to be able to find out what part of what they're saying is really resonating with their base. And I think Bernie actually did a really good job at that, better than a lot of people are willing to give him credit for. He was able to keep together a coalition of people that, you know, otherwise never really would come together, right? So I think he did a really good job of identifying the issues, and I think Medicare for All was the cornerstone one, that no matter how revolutionary you want to think you are, privatizing nearly 1/5 of the American economy, like socializing 1/5 of the American economy for the benefit of public health, that's not chicken shit. Just because other countries have it, just because in other countries it's not a leap, doesn't mean it wouldn't create a full-scale capitalist response, right? So what he was doing was, and you know, you and I have talked about this before, getting into the nitty-gritty of like whether he was revolutionary or whether he was really a socialist is really missing the point. And if that's what you're interested in, I think you have a lot to learn about politics. Because for us, the goal is to get working class people together on the basis of a shared economic interest to act politically, collectively, right? In their interest. If you're worried about certain words and phrases that are being used all the time but whether or not somebody's revolutionary enough or whether or not they're really a socialist or something like this, you're missing whether or not you're getting at the point, right? And I think Bernie, by the standards of American politics, was way out on left field, and yet mainstreamed his politics very, very well. So, you know, to me, the question of whether or not he was a revolutionary or whether or not we should be pumping up the revolutionary side of it, it's like, no, not really. What we should have been, you know, what Bernie did was what Bernie should have done, which was emphasize a legacy of FDR, emphasize Medicare for all, emphasize a rootedness in, you know, the American political context, which shows that he after all, he's running to be the leader of the country. He can't act as if he doesn't understand the basic political parameters of the country. It would totally make him, you know, anathema to most voters. Most voters are not leftists who think in ideological terms. They want somebody who's going to be a leader, who's going to actually provide something for them, who's going to win something and do something for them. So if you're looking at from the perspective of most voters, they're not sitting there with a checklist looking at these different candidates and seeing whether they tick all the right ideological boxes. They're taking a kind of broad sweep, pulling in all this information and trying to make a decision based off what they have. In that context, Bernie did very well. I mean, Bernie and Biden were the two most liked contenders from the beginning of the race to the end of the race.
Yep.
Which says he did really, really well. And I think that it's really hard to downplay how successful the Sanders campaigns were in terms of mainstreaming a kind of politics and a thought process that has not been visible on the left for a really long time.
Is there a third way? I use that intentionally. I know this will trigger a bunch of people, but it's like I see one, you know, I get the pushback when people talk about the ground that has been made in the last couple of years, because it's like, also not really, right? Like Bernie lost these 2 races. There's a lot of fanfare about, certain folks elected to Congress. Predominantly in 2018, the people got elected to Congress were like literally former CIA agents that found Donald Trump distasteful. And so it's like, and Bernie lost his share. He actually didn't perform as well this time as he did in some ways in 2016. So I get the sort of like, hey, if this is winning, I don't want to know what losing looks like. Now, and so basically, I'll just put it there. What's the sort of answer to that, as we still really are very significantly in the political margins?
Yeah. So I think that, Nagel and Tracy hit on this, and it's a point that a lot of leftists have a hard time coming back to, which is they say, we can't be satisfied with winning the ideological war. And they're right. They're right about that.
Right.
The key is that the argument from the other side shouldn't be, oh, we won the war of ideas, because that stuff can evaporate in a week. You know what I mean? Medicare for all right now is very popular. Obviously, we're in the midst of a pandemic, so it has a special appeal in the American public right now. But that kind of stuff can evaporate very quickly. All it takes is a really effective corporate media campaign, and suddenly Medicare for all is the least popular program in the history of the world. So there is a limit to what we can do with what some people call the Overton window. What's important for us is not, in my opinion, not so much the winning the ideological war, which is ephemeral. It's the political practice that we got through these campaigns, right? And I think it's really hard to claim that the number of people who are organizers, political leaders, trade unionists, people who are engaged politically have not been greatly benefited. 50 years of knowledge in 5 years on how to do politics in the real world with masses of real people connecting to real issues. Before this, the left was effectively isolated from all political practice. There was no meaningful left-wing political practice. It was going to a protest or, showing up at a picket line in solidarity, but there was no attempt at dealing with the question of the state. How do we wield it? What programs do we push? What do we do when we're trying to run for office? No one even thought about those questions. And if they did, they thought about them purely in the abstract because they had no real connection to it. So if we shift the grounds away from, oh, they won the ideological war, and instead say we are back into a connection with political practice that we haven't had in 50 years, that's a real thing. That is a real thing. And it's not a victory. Like, we don't have to sugarcoat it and say, oh, it's a victory that we're back in a political practice. But it gives us raw material, right? It gives us raw material that we haven't had in a long time. And nobody can pretend, no matter how much they're embittered by the defeat or whatever, nobody can pretend that their political lives are the same now as they were before Sanders ran. They can complain that we didn't win Medicare for all yet. They can complain that we weren't able to fit 70 years of social democratic reform into 5 years of campaigning. Sure, I'll concede. I'm surprised we didn't get Sweden out of 5 years of campaigning. But what they can't say is my political life is the exact same. I'm going to the same tiny little book club reading groups. I'm doing the exact same things as I was doing in 2015. It's just not true. There's a much bigger left public sphere. There's a much greater level of activity among leftists, among organizers, and among trade unionists than there were before 2015, before Sanders decided to run. So give credit where credit's due. It put us back in touch with reality. And it put us back in touch with an actually existing American working class that now we have the time to grapple with. Now we have the time to think about what that means and figure out how we actually build this thing for victory, right? So I think we should think about the Sanders campaigns as an experiment done on the American political, system. And the results of that experiment are we have a fair chance at getting pretty far in this thing if we play our cards right.
Right. And then that's also another reason why we got to, let go of all the stupidity and bad habits that are holding us back. But before we get to that, and then specifically the relationship with trade unionism, which is distinctly important and you can speak to, remind us, the media was actually really fucking bad.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is one of the things that I was very surprised to read in their piece. was totally discounting the power of the mass media. And, discounting it on an instrumental level as to how it affected his campaign, and discounting it on a structural level as to how it actually sorts political lenses in American politics. So everybody knows those statistics about how, Joe Biden got $70 million worth of so-called earned media 2 days before Super Tuesday. That's nearly half of what Bloomberg spent on his entire ad budget. Everybody knows that Bernie got less airtime than any other candidate for the entire first half of his campaign until he won Iowa. It was ridiculous that we could pretend that has no effect on voters, right? And the truth is that, the campaign itself could have made more use of television ad dollars and could have, pushed more money into television ads. But all that says is that the media does matter. Because if it's the case that television ad dollars were a make or break in some counties here or there, then it's the case that nightly news coverage of Mayor Pete is why that man won Iowa and New Hampshire. It's hard to make any sense of why rural voters who don't particularly like Democratic candidates in general went for Pete Buttigieg in Iowa and New Hampshire, other than to say, look at how much media this guy got. Look at how much just totally quote unquote earned media. He just blanketed the airwaves all day long about how he was a wonderkind, how he spoke all these languages. He's brilliant. He could solve the crisis in the Middle East in 2 weeks. So these kind of things matter. And
is electable. I mean, that's the biggest thing.
Yeah. He comes
and
off.
That was Biden's,
But yeah, he comes off as electable. And then the larger problem, and you bring up the electability thing, if the liberal media or the nonpartisan media is crowing for 4 years straight that the only thing that matters is getting Donald Trump out of the White House, well, then you're training voters to think that, what I need to look for in a candidate is who can get Trump out of the White House. And guess who's telling you who can do that? The same media that told you that that's the most important thing. So it's significant that this was the first election where electability trumped issues across the board for Democratic primary candidates. Many Democratic primary voters said, no, I care more about getting an electable candidate than getting someone that agrees with me. And that shows you how deep that shift in the liberal media narrative was, how effective it was. And then beyond that, if we zoom out even more, the mass media, the mass political media, since at least the 1980s, focuses on no substantive political debate whatsoever. Their entire focus is on petty little squabbles in personality differences and things like that. They don't interrogate the meaning of policies. They don't bring on experts to explain how a socialized healthcare system works in Sweden. All they do is demonize the welfare state, regardless of what channel. They demonize the welfare state. They say it's failing. News anchors, if you watch any news anchor on the mass media, first questions they ask anybody who's proposing an expansion of the welfare state are hostile questions.
Right.
No one is ever like, I think this is a good idea. How do you think we should implement it? They're always immediately hostile to anybody who says they want to expand public goods. So to me, from the macro to the micro level, the media has played such an insidious role in American public life and has really distorted the politics of our country and the way we think about politics, political parties, and candidates. It's hard to undo that with, social media and Twitter and Facebook.
And I think that's again where maybe some of the campaign and those of us who got excited were, we were wrong or deluded at times. I mean, this stuff is still incredibly powerful, but that's kind of the point. It's incredibly powerful, and also, again, this is something that actually that Tracy and Nagel point to correctly in terms of this electability thing. But then that brings us up again to another contradiction about how to deal with things like impeachment in Russia, which is like. And I think it's true. I think that clearly they needed to sit down before they ran and say to themselves, the real heart of this campaign is obviously getting rid of Donald Trump and getting rid of the conditions that led to Donald Trump. And that's talking about how rotten things are in this country for people who aren't rich, basically. And we're going to have and revitalizing labor and so on. No doubt about it. And then at the same time, okay, 2018, a bunch of affluent suburbanites with no economic agenda they're the reasons the Democrats won the House. How do we synthesize those things in a primary? Now, I think it was, and I think they, obviously they tried to, and Bernie did use that rhetoric of Trump and the conditions that led to Trump, but they needed to have a much, frankly, more staid message, in my opinion, essentially pretending that what they did was what they were doing was in some type of way, the only chance of a return to normal was through this reform path, was basically the contradiction that, the circle they needed to square. I think that's true. And I think all of the kind of revolution rhetoric and a whole bunch of other things, and not having speeches be vetted at rallies, like, I agree. I 100% agree. And at the same time, again, I mean, just, what the comedy part of the piece for me was like, okay, and then going out and hitting like the biggest area that these people have been frothing at the mouth and propagandized about for 3.5 years, and, like announcing that that's bullshit. I don't see how that's going to work.
Right.
You needed to somehow appeal to that normality sense. And I think actually this is going to be a bigger problem beyond Bernie, because somehow it's going to need to be that these big reforms are not taking us off into some, odd future that folks, don't necessarily want, but actually are going to be the stabilizers that allow them to have some sense of continuity in what they like.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, look, Bernie tried his best at the beginning of the campaign to say that I am the Trump slayer. I am the one who can beat Trump and return us to a reasonable semblance of, political life and expand democracy, expand rights, expand our freedoms, and give us some public programs and social goods that we've long been denied as Americans. But the challenge is always that, like, again, it's really hard to make that case when the entire political class and the media class have come up with a narrative that says the only way to win is by moderation, right? The only way to win is to be moderate on policy. And this is how you get this odd contradiction that people are struggling with, which is, how is it possible that a majority of Americans consistently say they support Medicare for all, they consistently rate healthcare as a top issue, and they consistently said that Bernie was the person they trusted most on healthcare, and they voted for Joe Biden. And again, it comes back to, if they think Joe Biden is electable because Joe Biden is moderate, then they're going to try to reach it. Look, liberals were shocked, truly shocked by Trump. It really, really upset their sensibilities, it upset their political compass, and it made a lot of them think and doubt, average Democratic voters think to themselves, and I think this has a lot to do with the electability argument, why Biden ended up on top. It made them think, look, I like these things, but how the hell am I going to win over these Trump voters? I have to get some of those Trump voters to vote for my candidate. How the hell could I do that? And they think the way to do that is by moderating. That's the way that they're told you win over people, is to moderate your politics. And so it makes sense that a lot of them, even though they supported Sanders personally, they voted to say, I'm going to vote for the more moderate candidate. I'm going to vote for the guy I think that's electable. To me, it's a really tough thing to change in the span of 4 years.
But then the funny thing, though, then is the inverse from the polling that basically tells us that the actual moderate, to the extent that even exists in the country, is basically, socially moderate and potentially economically progressive.
Right.
So it's always the opposite of what the media's thing is like any social progress trend imaginable, ultra liberal, and then we never tax anybody, right? That's quote unquote moderate, even though every piece of empirical data we have is just the opposite of that.
Yeah, and that's the case that we have to make, right? Like I think there's a lot of really great research on why it's so hard for Democrats to win rural areas. And, we touched a little bit on the rural question, but like, it is a structural fact that the Democratic Party is poisoned in rural areas. It can run up the score in presidential popular votes, it can run up the score in every major city in the country and still lose state house votes by wide margins, still be completely incapable of winning the Senate, and still lose the Electoral College. And, I think we may see a repeat of that this time, and even more, an even greater exacerbation of the urban-rural divide if Biden loses to Trump on electoral votes. We'll see tallies in the cities for Biden go through the roof, and in rural areas be not even able to register. So the structural problem of the urban and rural divide is a real serious one. But many of the political commentators, when they look at this, their solution is always the same, which is, well, the Democrats are too left-wing to win rural voters. But when you look, as you say, when you look at the data, it doesn't really turn out that way. The reality is that on most economic issues, those people like what people like Bernie Sanders have to say. In fact, he still had, of all the Democratic candidates, when polled, he was still the top one for rural voters. Even though those voters didn't turn out to vote for him in the primary, he was still the one that was preferred the most among rural voters. So there's a way of front-loading an economic agenda that speaks to rural people and says, look, rural working class people says, look, we know that you're not happy with the Clintons. We know you're not happy with the Bidens. And we know you're not even very happy with the Obamas of the world. But you do agree that we need more public goods, a stronger social safety net, higher wages, and we need to rebuild our manufacturing core. We are the party that cares about doing those things. But the Democrats don't want to do that because their game is to win the margins in the suburbs, right? Their strategy is specifically tailored on winning the group that is moderate on both social and economic issues, which is the suburbs of major cities, right? So if the Democratic Party can step out of its normal mode and think of itself as a party that's trying to win workers over to itself, it can start to win rural areas. But this is where I think we need to come in, because our insurgent candidates have to win rural areas. We have to prove that we can do this. We have to show positive proof that we can win non-college educated rural voters over to our project. And if we can do that, then, that to me is a real political revolution. It's a real shift in the way politics is done in this country, because all of the people say, if you go too left, a rural voter will never vote for you. And they all say the only way to win, white working class support is to be racist or to be, conservative or something like this. There's no real evidence to show that that's true, but we have to prove that that's not the case.
That's actually another really important part of the piece. And maybe I want to get more specifically to trade unionism stuff at the end, but I think this is really important because it's an answer to, a lot of ridiculous and unhelpful caricatures that you hear from the left. And it's also a great rebuke of a lot of mainstream essentialist narratives, which is that basically America's working class writ large is, I'll keep saying, I'm saying socially moderate and tolerant in a positive sense. Numbers on immigration, as an example, especially relative to other industrialized countries, are enormously positive. And I want to add a frame. I think I think Benjamin Fong put it this way. Ben Fong, I think. I don't have it in front of me, but I've been, I think in the Bellows, I think. Maybe it was Damage. Forgive me. But very helpful sort of way of delineating three things. So there's an economic base. And you and I have been saying, a lot of people I think have been sort of saying like, okay, the economic base, the universal reach of programs like single payer or persuading people that unions are probably a good idea, which, is sort of happening now. And then a clear and uncompromising, and this is, this is a fight that we'll have if we'll have it. And obviously there's serious elements of the Republican Party that want to have this fight. And I think you can't deny that. And it's delusional to deny it, that the rights revolution of the 60s and what has flown out of that in terms of saying that we are going to have a civic and legal equity in this society across the board. And we're going to have strong protections, whether, civil rights, voting rights, and every type of civic equity across any kind of metric, race, gender, and so on. That those two things are, and then there's like the culture of wokeness, right? This culture of, policing people's conduct and language. And so, and again, it's like, just looking at it objectively, this stuff is enormously unpopular. Like, poll numbers endlessly show it. Anecdotes endlessly show it. I think even in the kind of pop, representations show it, that even like, sometimes the amount of conversations that take place around quote unquote woke issues that are actually not even dealing with serious substantive threats to people's rights, but like, petty controversies or gossip or whatever is just repulsive and off-putting. And I think a very easy way of sort of delineating these three things. And I wanted to run that by you in light of also your emphasis on the numbers, that there's a lot of ground to be made in this country when it comes for big buy-in for, maybe not every single aspect of being, people are going to have different, attitudes, cultural expressions, whatever. But it's like, I'll stop rambling in a second. But I mean, I know people who are, as an example, like they're Orthodox Jews. They have pretty conservative private lives, and they are not interested necessarily in, any number of sort of ways of being more, socially enlightened in their attitudes, including ways, obviously, I find enormously off-putting, right? They're not also interested in, hearing that the earth isn't 6,000 years old. But in their cases, they're absolutely open to voting for Democrats. They usually do. They have zero question and an objection that on legal, political, and civic levels that every single human being needs to have full rights and recognition across the board. And they certainly think that everybody should have robust public goods across the board. Why am I having any argument with them about their private attitudes? It's just irrelevant. And at a cost for the other two things, because this is the point of your piece. This is what Republicans want to be doing all day, even as they substantively get rid of public goods and actually genuinely assault substantive rights, whether it's of asylum seekers or voting rights or anything else.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's a couple different ways to sort of tackle this, right? Like,
yeah.
The one thing that I always say, like the example I always give is when people say like, well, what do you mean? Does it mean that you want to throw you want to throw certain groups under the bus by not fighting the culture war? It's like, of course not. That's a ridiculous and hysterical way of reading that argument. But here's an example, right? The Republican Party wants and has always wanted to destroy OSHA and workplace safety legislation, right? They want to get rid of all of it. Anything that has to do with safety on the job, they want to get rid of it instantaneously, right? So I'm going to turn a light on here. The Republican Party loves to tear up any kind of regulation on workers' rights. Do they ever campaign on it? Will you ever hear a Republican going out saying, I want to destroy your rights on the job? No, because they know it's horrendously unpopular. Yet we can be sure as shit that every time one of those motherfuckers gets in office, they will do exactly that. They will tear up your union card. They will make sure that you have low safety regulations. They will make sure that anything that you try to do to fight back against the corporate system is illegal, right? So why it's so hard for people on the left to think about this in the same mechanism, which is to say that why campaign on unpopular things? You just shouldn't campaign on the parts of your agenda that are unpopular, even if they really matter to you, even if they're things that you personally think are very important. If they do not speak to the constituency, if you cannot mobilize working people around that program, it's just really not something that you can campaign on. I'm sorry, this is politics. It's not, it's not Reddit. It's not where you get to go find your niche and be happy in that little bubble. You have to appeal to people that are much larger, constituencies that are much bigger than you and your friends. So to me, the narrative of like, well, if we say we're getting rid of the culture war, it means we're throwing all these people under the bus. It's just not true. Second of all, the level of progress that working people, that we have made in this country among working people for things like the rights revolution is just astounding. And it's something that leftists, for whatever reasons, will not take the W on. Like, they will never say, yeah, civil rights was incredibly effective. Yeah, actually, we won some really impressive gains in terms of the internal culture in this country and the way that attitudes towards a whole host of minorities have developed, right? It is just a fact that the American working class is the most socially and culturally enlightened in the world. You can't prove it to me otherwise. The average American worker has more tolerant, multicultural views on most things than workers in any other part of the world. And, Castro may disagree with me, but I have to
say Castro might question that. And that doesn't mean, and again, look, does it mean that it's an endpoint? Does it mean that there still aren't a myriad of, of course there's still, and again, I even want to keep emphasizing the distinction between, sort of personal moral projects and the realm of that in politics to begin with, even including, again, I'm stipulating really, really fucked up and, like even in some cases, just like bad stuff or stuff that isn't bad, stuff that just shouldn't matter to you or stuff that's great, but is not necessarily in the realm of political trajectory. And I think actually, to me, as someone, and I know to you, that is actually, I see a backlash at times where it's like, no, actually what a Trump administration or a Republican Supreme Court is doing on voting rights is a serious rights threat. Yeah. What is happening in terms of, even the modest moves that the Eric Holder Justice Department made on police departments and how they've been reversed by Sessions. I mean, these are serious things that to me flow in that second context of substantive rights revolution, which is in the best tradition that I think we're trying to evoke here of people like A. Philip Randolph, is connected and is inseparable from a broader fight and a broader struggle. And I just think, but in this sort of like broader realm of personal, political, pop culture stuff, we have to just be laissez-faire. And we have to recognize that in an open society, people are going to constitute themselves into a variety of different groupings. They're going to have different social practices, different languages, and they're going to flow in different ways. And that has to be okay. And it has to not be the base upon which, your politics flows. It's because it's both a disaster in of itself. And I think also what you're saying is really important, that it just isn't taking obvious W's like, wow, a lot of voters are actually opposed to like putting children in cages. And that does not mean that the next step is you go and you demand that, like a nation state doesn't exist. Right. That's not your opening for, right. This is why we have to get rid of America, KKK.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, whoa, yeah. Calm down.
And I'll do two more anecdotes from the old sort of civil rights lefties. It's like, Michael Harrington used to always say that I don't know how socialists are expected to change the country if they're always talking about how much they hate its residents. Right. Like, how on earth are you expected to win people over if you're constantly harping about how awful American people are?
Absolutely.
Just idiotic. But the other thing I want to say, because this was a point you made earlier, is, Bayard Rustin made this brilliant point about racism in American society. He said, look, racism is always going to be present in any society that has scarcity, because it is a rational way for people to make sense of why they don't have something that other people have. They just look around them and they pick a group and they say it's their fault, right? It makes sense to them to do that. It happens everywhere in the world, right? And Rustin's point was not, Rustin said, the point is not that we will be able to completely eliminate the kernels of racism in people's mind. The point is to reduce the economic foundations of it manifesting politically. Because if you can bring it down to an irreducible minimum such that nobody can organize on it, such that no consequential political action is taken on the basis of those prejudices, you've had a significant victory. You've had a really, really significant victory in your society. And that is what we haven't done, right? Like anybody who is shocked by the Trumps and Orbans and other right-wing populists of the world, all you have to do is look at the economic foundations of those societies. The absolute rot of the economic foundation of a society allows right-wingers to organize racism politically. And when you can organize xenophobia and organize these things politically, then they're dangerous. Because instead of somebody just having private prejudices, they're using those private prejudices to craft policy, right? So our job is not to say everybody's got to have their slate wiped clean in order for them to have some sort of perfect project. Our job is to say we need to reduce the possibility of politically organized xenophobia and politically organized racism and bigotry and et cetera, et cetera. I think that we can do that without jumping into the realm of being sort of weird about our politics, just being weird. I mean, I think that a lot of the left can just be really weird and off-putting. And so
yeah, it's as simple as that. Yeah.
We can win. We can do that. We can effectively say, look, you can keep voting for somebody like Trump, or you can vote for Medicare for all. And that is a way of saying, oh, well, okay, here's a divide that's meaningful. If we play the right's game, and this is where I think so much of the devastation of the left has created basically a Stockholm syndrome, where they're totally held captive by the right's game. So the right says, oh, the left wants to kill babies. And the left often responds by saying, yeah, we do. And it's totally insane. But it's the way in which the right has so captured the media narrative that many people on the left think that the way that you respond to that is by being more outlandish, by like sort of sticking it to them and being even more like crazy about your political positions. But really, people don't want to hear that. The way you win is by shifting the terms of the debate entirely, by putting the terms of the debate on footing where you can be in the majority, by putting the terms of the debate in footing where the Republicans have to say, no, we hate Medicare for all, repeatedly, on camera, over and over and over again. That's how we win. We're never going to beat them at their culture. They're always going to find some new thing to be hysterical and upset about, and we're always going to have to be like, I didn't even know that was a thing. I didn't even know that.
Right. That's 100. And also the ways in which even the, like, you know, how they do it. Like, yes, if you say, no, we want to kill babies, then okay, we're at, you know, a ridiculous ideological standstill. But then if you say, like, actually, we all know that a vast majority of people recognize that that's a necessary procedure.
Right.
To be safe and be legally available, and people shouldn't be, you know, shamed or harassed about. And you could think whatever you think about that, because even plenty of people who think it is morally wrong don't question the legality of it. And they also don't question, by the way, another way you could flip it is they also don't question when they see fucking assholes out harassing people and terrorizing women in front of a clinic, because that's them. And you can allow them to be the weirdos.
Right, exactly.
You're freaks.
Yes.
You're sexist freaks. You're You're bothering people. You're not being normal. Stop being a fucking weirdo. And while and of course we're there because, you know, it's a policy and we're going to protect it and so on, obviously, but like, we're going to get back to the business of getting everybody all the healthcare they need.
Right.
I guess you want to be some type of like, you know, goofball Al-Qaeda.
Right, exactly.
Sure.
And that's the way, and that's the way you frame it. You don't cede to their terms of debate, which essentially say that your position is already insane. You make them look like the fools they are and the weirdos they are by saying, look, actually what we want to do is expand healthcare to everybody. And part of that is saying, yes, most Americans think abortion is a good thing, and we think that we're going to protect it. So part of that means that people have to be able to afford it, don't you think? Because you can't really say that it's a right if people can't afford the damn thing. That's a way of actually getting beyond the like simple culture war nonsense of screaming back and forth at a dinner table where nobody is convinced of either person's argument. You have to be able to put yourself in a position to win a majoritarian argument. You can't put yourself in a position to just respond to everything the right is saying about you. And I think because of the weakness of the left, it's that reactive relationship with the right that gives many leftists this feeling of like, we have to say more outlandish things than what the right is saying in order to compete with them.
Or, you know, we have to have an answer, like, I don't want to I don't want to get into to another sort of debate here, but like I think it's very important and very useful to have some answers on monetary policy, and that's great and that's very lovely, very useful. But like, we are not, the reason we are not doing these things is not because there is any type of misunderstanding about what we can do with monetary policy. In fact, Republicans are quite clearly comfortable with expansionary monetary policy. They just want it to give money to rich people and build weapons and do like aggressive primitive accumulation. Like these are the raw power dynamics. And I think it was just a really important point in your piece, though, to say that like, if you could just step back a little bit and have like a little bit more confidence in your fellow citizens, which, at some point you're going to have to, because the left is literally a mass project. You can actually see like, oh, there's actually like, there aren't as many, and because there are in some contexts, I think that, occasionally you look at polls, you're like, whoa, like this many people think that shit. That's difficult. It's difficult to be in Germany and say like, you're wrong about what's happening in Greece. And, I got to somehow persuade you, because there's practical effects of that. There a lot of areas in the United States in terms of kind of broad buy-in that we could certainly in a substantive way work off of, which is a good thing. What about the push towards trade unionism? Because I think you and I, definitely agree that if there is going to be the only hope towards revising this kind of mass countervailing force to both the suburban Democratic Party and the, bloated nationalistic Republican Party is trade unionism. So in light of all of this, where are we at with that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the case that one of the things that I sort of criticized about Nagel and Tracy's article was they really didn't mention anything about the labor movement, and again, it's once again this thing that leftists seem to have looked over, which is the only thing that has ever given a left any sort of power, right? It's the only thing that has ever made gains in any major country is the strength of its labor movement, right? And so our task needs to be rebuilding that movement in a significant way, because it needs to be the case that candidates like Sanders aren't this sort of come out of nowhere, incredible, charismatic, thing that just shows up one night. It has to be the case that we have a stable of leaders that we can look to and that have a real institution behind them that we can say, this is where our strength comes from. This is where we have our home base, and until we can do that, it's going to be consistently difficult for us to actually have leaders that speak to ordinary working people, because it's already hard enough to convince a random voter that you're going to do something for them that they've never seen before, right? Something like Medicare for All. It's much, much, much harder for that person to do it if you don't look like them, if you don't sound like them, if you don't come from their world, right? So one of the best ways to win the working class over is to build the organizations of the working class, right? We shouldn't think about workers as this group over here, but instead think about their organizations, unions in particular, as the home basis for our power. And to me, much of what the electoral left thinks is that the union movement is either too stodgy or it's too alien from the kinds of things they're trying to do. And hopefully that's starting to change. I think it might be. I think some on the sort of progressive millennial left have recognized the power of the union movement and the reason that it's so important. But if we're going to succeed, it needs to be the case that candidates like Sanders and candidates like Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, they can walk into any union hall in the country and get a standing ovation. We want our leaders to be able to go to a union hall and be received warmly. And until we can have that kind of situation, we're going to really struggle to connect with the institutional power and the basic political subject that's at the heart of our project, which is working people, right? And to me, our task, both in elections and outside of elections, is to build up the institutions of working people such that it's not some candidate coming to the union hall to glad hand, but that it's a guy from the union hall going out, A guy from, somebody who in your, a sister or brother in your bargaining unit is saying, you know what, I'm running for state house. You know what, I'm going to run for Congress.
Right.
To me, that's the relationship that the electoral left should have with the union movement, right? It should not be a relationship of pure transaction. And so when leftists get frustrated that the unions didn't endorse this progressive or they didn't endorse this socialist, you have to look at it both ways, right? It's also frustrating for unions to hear all of a sudden that there's this socialist thing that they're supposed to care about and they're supposed to be really excited about because the millennial left is all about it. No, we have a lot of work to do to meld the success we've had in the electoral realm with the labor movement. And I think that we need to build the kinds of organizations that can throw up real charismatic leaders, people that we can say, this is a product of the labor movement. They're a union-made candidate. That's who we want, right? Look for the union label, something like that.
Yeah, and that's also, and then that's interesting because I think you mentioned the Blue Dogs, where most of the Blue Dogs at the end of the day were just right-wing Democrats. I mean, both in terms of economic issues, many of them are very corporate funded, as well as triangulating to the right. I mean, go back and look at Bill Clinton's race baiting, or Joe Biden's for that matter, as some of the more famous examples. But one of the points you make very concretely is that as long as people who represent some type of, social democratic impulse in the House, including, people we like Rashida Tlaib, obviously, who, I think we should definitely support her. She's fighting off a primary challenger. I think it's definitely important to keep her in the House. But Pelosi is obviously there, and the leadership is there with the suburban right. And as long as that's the case, that the only people that they're, the base of people that they have in competitive districts are those affluent, woke CIA districts. What incentive structure? People, it doesn't matter because it's like, sure, you have a bunch more people in the Progressive Caucus, but maybe somebody will just primary you who's more pliant to the leadership. Great. What incentive? There is zero incentive structure for them to go against their ideology and their donor base until you have people that start coming in competitive districts and actually winning. And in order to do that, you're going to need a lot more flexibility in terms of the candidates that you're looking for.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think the Blue Dogs and the old Boll Weevils who were against FDR's program are this example that the Democrats have always used to be like, look, this is a group of people we got to have because they can win in Republican districts. And if we don't have them, we're never going to be competitive in Republican districts. The problem is today, I think we can run a live experiment and figure out if it's true. And I suspect it's not, just given all the public opinion data. We can run staunchly left-wing candidates in these rural districts, in these swing districts. And if they're effective at reaching those voters and we can flip those districts, that's a tremendous amount of leverage. Because those Blue Dogs have always been able to hold the leadership hostage because all they have to say is, look, we're the ones you need. You can replace any New York congressperson with any other New York congressperson. They will always vote with the Democrats. We Blue Dogs may not vote with the Democrats, but you need us because if you don't have us, we don't have a congressional majority. So we need to be able to have our own proof of concept there and say, look, we can win in just as diverse districts, right? We can win in non-college educated white districts. We can win in diverse Bronx districts, right? If we can do that, it gives us a real edge on what we're saying, right? But the only way we can do that is if we really connect with the kinds of organizations in those areas that represent working people, right? And it's
so final question on that. I mean, then should we be looking more closely at Sherrod Brown as an example? Who are the actual models here? Because, we've got some people, they've won, that's great. I think some of them are doing some very good things and we support them. Obviously, Bernie is just this one-of-a-kind historical figure. I think throwing him under the bus is counterproductive and ridiculous. We can critique the campaign and there's plenty of legitimate critiques, but he's a very, very valuable figure to say the least, if you have any maturity about it, in my view. But these examples are not the examples you're talking about. And I think the closest probably is a guy like Sherrod Brown from Ohio.
Yeah, I think Brown is an example of this, but I think even more so, there are a number of state level candidates that don't get enough attention that come out of the union movement, and if you look at their platforms, in Pennsylvania, we have a guy named Dave Galassa. If you look at his platform, he comes out of a fairly not super hyper liberal district, right? A kind of district where you could easily see a Republican winning every other election. I think he was the first Democrat to represent his district in a long, long time. You look at his platform and it's pretty left-wing. It's not as left-wing as we would be, right? Like, he doesn't say Medicare for all, but he's talking about public funding of higher education. He's talking about, universal health care, all this kind of stuff. And he's a Teamster, and these are the kinds of people that can win in these districts, even with a fairly liberal message, because they are from those districts and they're working people. So they're relatable in a way that is hard to replicate with campaign tactics.
I mean, Stan Greenberg, who I've mentioned, very conventional Democratic pollster, but I mean, he's shown, the numbers are there, that yes, look, you push for Medicare for all, which we absolutely should. I'm not questioning that in any way. But yes, if you push like that, there can definitely be some effective means for propagandistic counter-programming. And we saw some of that, obviously, with Biden in the primary. But, besides that, I mean, he's steadily showing that basically, like, look, and this is this is a Clinton advisor. This is as mainstream as you can get. He's on the sort of liberal side of the third way, but he's just like, most Americans are down for, pretty progressive policies in terms of immigration. And the big thing Democrats need to focus on is the inequality crisis and helping people stay in their houses. And the numbers are there. And again, this is from somebody who has, maybe not every incentive in the world, but this is not somebody who's reading The Jacobin or watching this, to say the least.
Right.
And so, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So we need to start thinking about candidates that come from actual places, wherever those places may be, and then sort of mass marketing these policies, basically, with seems like a relatively simple formula, sort of like.
This is why I'm optimistic. I guess I'm more optimistic than a lot of people. I think that we actually have a future now. I don't think 5 years ago you could have said there was much of a future, but now I think we can say there's a real future. Inequality, a simple message based on the obscenity of inequality, is very powerful. And if you look at the long arc of things, it's what Obama ran on. What I mean? Like, people forget this, but Obama ran on a sort of anti-inequality message that got him elected and got him to win 46% of non-college educated whites in every part of the country. Like, he did what people say that it's impossible to do. And Sanders almost did similarly, right? So we know what the message that works is. We got to find the candidates, and we need the institutional support to get those candidates over the line.
And we need to stop bad-mouthing mainstream unions. All right. Dustin, Dino, Guastella, thanks so much, brother. I really, really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Take care, man.
Take care, brother.
All right, guys. Let's take a brief break, and then we'll come right back with the gem.
Sounds good. Do I have time to smoke a cigarette?
Oh, break. Welcome back, Michael Brooks Show. It's gem time, folks.
Yeah. Well, this one is a continuation of a story that's pretty much been one of the bigger economic global stories when it comes to like the global financial system and how it preys on middle income, low income countries. So very recently, we've covered this a few times, but it's come to a head, and Argentina just defaulted on their debt payments. And this has been a long time fight that's been going on for a few months, basically since this crisis started. So just to recap for folks who aren't familiar with it, Argentina has been hit with the COVID crisis like any other society has. They've implemented a very strict social distancing regime that has come with the kind of basic human measures that you would expect to see from a humane government, right? Protecting people's wages, making sure that people have access to healthcare. And of course, this is completely unacceptable to the international financial community, specifically the bondholders that have a significant interest in Argentinian debt that was primarily picked up under the horrific neoliberal Macri, who was president up until very recently when the Fernandez regime took over. So this new government, the
maybe not regime.
What?
I'm just playing.
Oh, yeah.
I said maybe not regime. I'm playing.
Oh, whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. Whatever. That was a whatever point. Sorry. Go ahead.
So Fernandez's government has been, trying to renegotiate this significant debt, which is around $66 billion, which is denoted in foreign currency, which means that they have to pay that in US dollars, and they don't have an unlimited access to that currency. Which means that when they're making these payments, right, not only does it have like a financial toll on the system, it's also making the decision basically between buying medicines or paying off debts, right? Because if you only have access to so many US dollars, you have to decide how you're going to pay it. And with so many other of the international agreements and how you would buy medicine or medical equipment, a lot of people want dollars. So you actually have to make that hard decision too. So basically, they've been asking for a 3-year grace period, a cut on the interest rates, and a small cut to the principal of the debt. And even though the international community, the governments have basically come to the table with Argentina, which holds a significant amount of debt in general, these investors, private investors, are refusing to, primarily BlackRock, which is a really insidious firm. That has basically been bolstered over the past 15 to 20 years, but that's a different conversation. So right now they've been trying to renegotiate this debt with very reasonable demands, basically saying we're in the middle of an economic crisis and now we're facing COVID. There's no way we can make these debt payments. And in the long-term interest of those bondholders, of those BlackRock bondholders, they should want Argentina to take a little break on making those payments, because the alternative is so much worse. If Argentina actually is forced into making these payments when they can't, that means that they have to drastically cut services to people, that they won't have the money to basically restart their economy when the coronavirus crisis is over. Any kind of rational person can understand the argument for why demanding that these payments to be made is ludicrous. But fundamentally, this isn't about Argentina for these folks. It's about making an international example. And this is going to be a story that we're going to see more and more of. Low-income countries and middle-income countries have really been relying on a lot of private organizations to they've been relying on debt from private organizations rather than intergovernmental organizations or government-to-government organizations. And these organizations really want to make a strong message that they will let your country burn. You will pay them. And, I'll just say, like, the moral argument here is that these people made an investment. They made a bet on the neoliberal hellscape of Macri, right, which drastically cut services for average people across the board, right? They made an investment thinking that, oh, this is going to pay out in the long term. Well, the people revolted against this horrible neoliberal regime, and they put in a more humane center-left government there. So you know what? I'm sorry, those people should eat it. Like, if you want to be like a hardcore capitalist, right, you make a bad investment, you eat it. But what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to use the United States court system to punish Argentina. And because the United States military and economic power is so strong, the United States court systems basically have de facto power to, punish governments. This debt is unsustainable. What we're seeing right now is significant capital flight from Argentina, which has already been a problem. Somewhere around $300 billion is estimated to be held offshore accounts from the population of Argentina, which is a significant amount of money, especially when we're talking about the kind of debts that Argentina owes to the rest of the world. Argentina has been suffering from massive inflation, around 50% annually. I mean, like the system there is unsustainable in the first place, and basically demanding these outrageous debt payments continue is ludicrous. And you know who's come to the table on this as well? The IMF. Last March, the IMF, right, which is like probably an organization that you don't expect to basically come to the defense of indebted nations. The IMF came forward and they said they don't think that Argentina can service debt payments in foreign currency for 4 years. And when the IMF is being the voice of reason in this situation, it only goes to show just how outrageous these organizations like BlackRock are. So we'll see what happens. They've defaulted on this payment, but there are ongoing discussions. There are more bondholders than just BlackRock, and those bondholders are actually saying that they think that the conversations have been constructive, and that, it looks like they're getting closer to a deal. BlackRock, on the other hand, has been saying that they haven't heard anything reasonable coming from the Argentinian government. So June 2nd is now the new deadline for some kind of renegotiation for this debt, and something we need to be watching, not only to show solidarity and support for the Argentinian people, but because COVID has exposed a debt crisis and exposed overextension of debt to countries that basically were never going to be able to make the payments in the first place. There needs to be massive debt restructuring, and there needs to be an international solution to this problem that basically the major players, the United States, the EU, and all these countries allowed to happen, which was this massive extension of private debt. So we'll see, and like it's going to happen with Argentina. There's also questions about, for example, like the Chinese debt that has been, developed throrough Belt and Road. How are those countries going to be able to pay it back? I mean, there's going to have to be a massive kind of debt restructuring. And the first thing that needs to happen, though, is going to be to bring these private organizations to the table and not to allow them to basically hold entire nations hostage.
100%. That's great, David. And I would watch the conversation Grace Blakely and I had on this, go in the archive. It relates very well.
Yeah.
And generally there's a lot of areas, both domestic and internationally, of debts. We should just have debt jubilee.
Yeah.
I mean, on so many areas, medical debt, get that word in the zeitgeist. It actually was part of a big push around, and it was adjacent to the globalization movement around between 1999 2001 or so, and it was something to some degree pursued somewhat sincerely in certain ways by particularly Gordon Brown in the UK. There was some actual debt relief, and there was a big push for a jubilee language from groups like Oxfam, and we need to get that back in, and we need to obviously it's not an act of charity, it's an act of politics and economics, and it should recognize the political arrangements and domination that have led us to those situations. So there are so many areas where simply canceling debts or allowing for radical restructuring will do so much, both for personal finance as well as global finance.
And I would just add as a selling point, like the language I think we really need to be using is democracy. Too, right? Because it's unreasonable that one administration, the Macri government, is basically able to devastate the negotiating power of an entire nation for decades on end, right? If the people don't want that government in power anymore, it's absurd to expect. We're not even saying get rid of all the debts, but it's absurd to expect that those debts at the ridiculously high interest rates that they had in the first place should be upheld. And fundamentally, it's a basic democratic question. Should political power reside with the people, or should it reside with the small group of investors incorporated around BlackRock?
Absolutely. All right, folks, we're going to go to the post game. The way you join us for the post game is by becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/TMBS and get the whole thing. Very important, what we're doing, and fun at the end of the day. So join us, patreon.com/TMBS. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, David. Thanks to everybody making this possible. We appreciate all of you. Thank you, Dustin Guastella. Read all of his writing. Dustin's absolutely on point. Next week, obviously, we'll be back this Sunday, part 2 of the illicit history of global propaganda in the United States and Russia with Mark Ames. That's a great conversation. And we'll also be premiering a conversation soon with Martin Jakes on When China Rules the World, continuing on our China and Asia series. Folks, be safe, stay strong. We'll see you in the post game.